Yeah. Okay, got it. All right. I don't know. Bonnie may be busy she's in tax season now. And I know that Alice has an appointment. So this may be all there is today. I'm going to go ahead and start with prayer. Gracious and merciful God, we thank you for this beautiful sunny day that lifts our spirits. We ask that you be with us, send down your Holy Spirit on our discussion, our reading, open our eyes, ears, minds, and hearts to what you would reveal to us today. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, we have one more week of Isaiah. Now this is in what we call third Isaiah. The third Isaiah really is 3 different books over different time periods. It's believed that the first Isaiah was written by Isaiah, the second and the third written in his name, because it's similar theology, talking about Israel at various times before the exile, during the exile, and after the exile. This one is written after the exile, in second Isaiah, there is a lot of talk about what they hope for Israel in the future, that things will be restored. However, when we get to third Isaiah, as you can tell from your reading, the exile is over, but things aren't necessarily corrected. The problems prior to the exile have not been totally eliminated. So the writer here is frustrated about that the people's priorities are skewed. The discussion is about worship, and this is one we read, passage we often read during Lent, particularly at the beginning of Lent. It appears
is this
now
Isaiah 58? Am I at the right place?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
It appears that the people appear to be deeply religious, and they're seeking God and wanting to delight in God's ways and draw near into God, but their theology isn't quite in sync with their ethics. There's still some of the same injustices going on. They're asking God, why we're doing all this stuff right. We're fasting, we're going to worship, but he said, God's saying instead, you're serving your own interests on fasting. It's kind of like they're trying to please God for their own benefit. And he said, meanwhile, you oppress your workers. There's still this gap between the rich and the poor. He says, is this not the fast that I choose, to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, and to break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your house? When you see the naked, to cover them, and not to hide yourself from your own kin. He's saying, well, this is when God is going to be in their presence. Just got a message from Bonnie. Held up doing taxes, may not be there. We'll go back to beginning. When we talk to, he says they go to the temple daily. They're seeking God, and that's a good thing. They're seeking to know God's ways, but their righteousness in keeping the law is purely ritual and is not external. What I mean when I say the theology and the ethics are not aligned. Anyway, so this is similar to other prophets of that time, like Amos and Micah. If you remember the reading last Sunday on Micah, eventually saying very similar message there. In Amos, fifth chapter of Amos, God announces that God hates or despises the people's religious festivals with all the praise songs and the various sacrifices which God refuses to accept. So again, Isaiah is calling out their hypocrisy.
But they're trying. They're not getting any credit for trying.
Well, yeah, what God is saying is that they're trying for their own benefit to get something from God for themselves, but they're not actually participating in God's justice and compassion and love.
Oh.
I mean, we hear the same things. I mean, this thread runs throughout Isaiah, which, as I've told you many times, Jesus loved the book of Isaiah, quoted from it more than anything else. And you keep reading over and over again about, taking care of the hungry and the homeless, the clothing the naked, breaking the bonds of injustice. That's all throughout Isaiah. And these are some of the same passages that Jesus quotes too. In fact, in the beginning of Luke, he uses a passage from Isaiah about these things, that he will come to do, that are come from that part of Isaiah, which is about the new servant leader that will come, and that Jesus identifies himself with that servant leader. So. And he makes it clear also that, to do justice means to get rid of the barriers that hold people down, the systemic injustice in society. This is the yoke, that they're supposed to lift from the poor and people that are oppressed. I came across a quote that I like. It's a book I read years and years ago, and I think I may no longer have the book. But a lady down the name of Sally McVeigh wrote a book called Life Abundant. And she writes, "If God is absent from this world, it is because we are."
Mm-hmm.
But God is saying, if they do these things, if they take the intention of what worship is trying to transform them into being, again, we're talking about being right with God, like we were last week. If their intention is truly to be in right relationship with God, rather than to have God do something for them, then God will protect them, will strengthen them, encourage them, and so forth. Essentially, it's to live in like in the image of God. There's a Jewish idea, theological idea called tikkun olam, which basically means the mending of the world. You know, and this is the idea that's being expressed here. And so, you know, it challenges us to consider how our actions, either, you know, expansive or small, play a role in mending the world, which for Isaiah is building, restoring, feeding, clothing, caring, repairing individuals, supporting community. Okay. Any comments?
No.
Okay. You know, I think, you know, you'll definitely see similarities or the same ideas expressed in the gospel passage for today. Psalm 112. Now, it is written as a pair with Psalm 111, and it is very, very much like the opening of the book of Psalms, where we have Psalm 1 is praising God, and Psalm 2 praises those who follow God and are obedient to God. And it works the same way with Psalm 111 and 112. Psalm 11, you know, writes praising God, and then Psalm 112 praises those who fear God. And in both, they write, his righteousness endures forever. They use similar phrases. The word delight is associated with happiness, but happiness not created by self-fulfillment, but by orienting oneself to God's purposes. And you see this is an echo of the Isaiah passage. Fear means basically submitting to God's sovereignty, humbling oneself, entrusting one's life and one's future to God. So, the happiness is not a reward that, you know, the worshiper earns, but it is that feeling of peace, of being right with God. That's what kind of happiness referring to. In verses 4 through 6, we hear the epiphany theme of light and dark. They rise in darkness as a light for the upright. They are gracious, merciful, and righteous. They conduct their affairs with justice. And the word, you know, this translated as deals generously, is from the same Hebrew root word as gracious. And also that entrusting one's life to God and embodying God's values provides not just happiness, but stability, both, you know, in the present and in the future. But also we read it, you know, from in verses 7 through 10, they are not afraid of evil things. Their hearts are firm, secure in the Lord. Will not be afraid. They will look in triumph on their foes. The psalmist is admitting here that it's not that things will always go great for them, but that they don't, but their trust in God makes them not fearful and doesn't cause them to stray from that inner ethic of being righteous and being in sync with God. He writes in verse 9, their righteousness endures forever. Their horn is exalted in honor. Horn was a symbol of strength and power. But then we have the reverse. But the ungodly, they're angry about what God does for the faithful, and so God, they'll be separated from God, and God won't, be present with them, won't hear their supplications. I thought it was kind of interesting. They are angry at the sight of all God gives the faithful. And what I think about is that about people that become so incensed when they think someone else has gotten something, even if it's something they have themselves. Our innate proclivity, I guess, is to want to have hierarchy. And this is something Paul talks about in the epistle, and that our tendency to want to always be above someone else. And that was one of the problems Paul was seeing in the church in Corinth. And essentially, it makes people not thankful for what they have. If they become jealous of somebody else having, the same thing, not someone being given something that they feel is, unjust, but just sharing in God's abundance.
That goes back to the commandments, thou shalt not covet.
Covet. Exactly. Because it creates a lot of dissension, division, and a lot of anger. And it goes back, it's really the person who feels that anger that is the one hurt and the one that becomes separated from the peace of God. When we get to the epistle, where it continues where we left off in last Sunday's reading from 1 Corinthians. The central issue is the difference and the conflict between God's wisdom and human wisdom. He talks about in verses 1 through 5 the use of human wisdom as a means of persuasion on behalf of the gospel. He says that, although he himself was gifted in these rhetorical arts, what he's saying here is that faith comes from God alone, not from the wisdom or the eloquence of human beings. And it appears from what we read in the epistles that one of the problems they had was people, a division occurring in the congregation when a big speaker would come in, and preach as though they had this special wisdom from God. And Paul's saying, only the Holy Spirit gives wisdom. And we might look at, some of the sort of false prophets that come in and raise a big crowd. Historically, the one I remember is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Billy Sunday.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
and he would draw huge crowds, but what he was preaching was not the gospel, kind of like the prosperity gospel. He was the streets of heaven are filled with gold, and if you follow what I'm saying, you're going to get rich. And that's not what the gospel tells us. But as I said, he had a grand following.
Yes, he did.
I think Tom even mentioned that one of his, I think it was grandparents, and his grandparents are, it goes way back because his parents were old and his grandparents, so we're talking, hundreds. But one of his grandparents, I think a grandfather, was, brought to Christ through Billy Sunday. I don't know what, eventually, he doesn't know much about him, and sometimes it is possible for people to be brought in by hucksters, but then in the course of coming into a congregation, they learn, as Paul said, a more mature knowledge of the Gospels. And that was one thing. I'm not at all a fan of Billy Graham, but one of the things that he did do that a lot of these preachers that would go around and speak in big arenas and who following, he would do the whole altar call business, and I guess they would count the numbers and so forth. But from what I understand, he always ended with, now you go join a church, and
Yes.
continue in your walk of faith, which is different from a lot of these, what I call the false gospels of, you just send me money,
Yeah.
and you'll be on the right track. That was not, although he did make that was not, his intention was to have people follow him, as a cult following. And that was Paul's ideology as well. He didn't want people to follow him. He wanted them to follow Christ, and what he's saying here is that, it's nothing that I say or any other, preacher tells you. It's God, the Holy Spirit, that brings you to Christ. Kind of reminds me of what my mentor used to say. He said, a preacher can't grow a church, but they sure can empty one.
Yes. In Tulsa, it was Oral Roberts University.
Yes, right.
It was amazing, and I had never heard of him before we moved there. So that was a surprise to see the lovely buildings and the prayer tower and everything else that he, quote, accumulated.
Yeah, I saw that firsthand. Lynchburg, Liberty University, Falwell's Liberty University is a big deal, and but Jerry Falwell was never after money. He was after power. That was his aphrodisiac. And now, that kind of power, the people that group has is more concerned with political power, and they've wedded their religion with political power. And that's something that Jerry Falwell did himself, when that moral majority started back in I guess probably the early 80s. A group of these evangelistic pastors, like Oral Roberts and so forth, they got together in a hotel in Northern Virginia, and they decided, what issue can we bring out that will give us, basically political power, to control how this country's going. And they decided that it was going to be abortion. And before that, they had never preached against abortion. It was a non-issue. But the idea was that this is something we can get people worked up about, and by doing that, acquire political power. And they succeeded.
But Saul had power when he was Saul.
Yep.
And when he became Paul, he also had power, but it was two different powers.
Yeah. And he was always pointing to Christ. And
he was reflecting his power. Yes.
Yeah. He said, it's all about, his message was, he says, he kind of sums it up, but he says it over and over again. My only message, is Christ and Christ crucified and resurrected. That was it. And he talked about being in Christ, not following Paul or anything. He said it's to, the goal is to be, as the Old Testament, being right with God. The goal was, and living in the image of God. For Paul, it was, you've gotten the message. Christ is God's messenger here. When you're when you're following Christ, then you're in sync with God. Christ called it the kingdom of God. And he also, he says in here that that what he's talking about is not some special kind of wisdom that only a few people had. Remember, that was the idea of the Gnostics, that there were these few people that had a particular knowledge. Kind of like there's one religion, I think it might be the Jehovah's Witnesses, that there's 144,000 people in the world that are saved, and these are the only people that, basically, will see God in eternity. There's a special group that has been chosen.
I never heard that.
No, aren't they the ones you have to go back and save your great grandpa and your grandma? There's one religion that they go back.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if
I don't remember now which one, but and that confuses me too.
If I can get myself.
We make it difficult sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can. They take this from a passage in Ezekiel. Let's see. I can find out which group it is that. There's the 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes with Judah and Benjamin joined together, stand in equal position. It comes from Ezekiel, and then it's repeated in Revelation. Okay.
So only those can be saved?
The Jehovah's Witness religion holds to the belief that the 144,000 represent the total number of saints who will ascend to the heavenly church. Okay, so it is the Jehovah's Witness.
Well, then you don't have a chance, because those have probably already been filled.
Not very good odds, is it?
Shucks.
But I think, to me, the Bible refutes that. And particularly, we look at Jesus and his inclusiveness, but then, Paul preaching, that the message that God has sent, he had already sent to the Jews and then extended it to the Gentiles, which means everybody else but the Jews. The intention was, as we read in Genesis with Abraham, the idea, the covenant was that Abraham's descendants would eventually cover, he called it the four corners of the world. And then throughout the Old Testament, they look at Jerusalem as being the center, where God resides, but that eventually all will, come to Jerusalem. All will come to God. So, Paul repeats over and over again that, the foundation of his preaching is Jesus Christ and him crucified. Is the wisdom of the mature believer comes from God and for God's plan for humankind. And Paul makes the statement that the church is part of God's plan for the salvation of the whole world. And again, like with Abraham, blessed to be a blessing. It's the church, not that it's exalted, but it's going to be like that light that draws everyone else in.
But he also said none of the rulers of this age understood this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, again, that gets back to his, the foolish and the wise, and those that the world call wise, which, the rulers, they made it to the top spot. You consider, oh, they're pretty sharp guys here. What Paul was preaching was, that what the worldly wisdom that they thought they had was not the wisdom of God. And the wisdom of God seems foolish to the people of the world. I mean, the message, the old corporate idea of, greed is good, that's worldly wisdom, you're smart, you make a lot of money, you get power over a lot of people, whereas the message of the gospel all is that you don't get power over a lot of people. God empowers you to be a servant to people. That's a reverse message there, and that's what Paul keeps emphasizing.
But it says that they would not have crucified the Lord, but if it was God's plan all along that he be crucified, I guess I'm a little confused.
Mm-hmm. But that's what is expected, was expected of human behavior. Their idea of power was different than God's idea of power.
Oh, I see.
I mean, when you look at it, when you look back, what we say now, who Pontius Pilate, I guess, was the one. Essentially, it was the Roman Empire that killed Jesus. So if we say, well, Pontius Pilate was the one that allowed it to happen, what happened to Pontius Pilate's power, and what happened to Jesus' power? The worldly power doesn't last.
Yes.
When we had the youth group one time, we at a retreat, we divided them, and whether or not Pontius Pilate should have been charged for murder.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very interesting what the youth group came up with, because of God's plan, but he did put murder, he did decree murder.
Mm-hmm.
It was thought-provoking on what they came up with. The defendant who was defending him and then defending Jesus.
Yeah. Well, it's like, look at today, you know, Putin has had the power to kill hundreds and thousands of people.
Yeah.
And he has, but is that power going to last? Once he's gone, you know, what will be his legacy? You know,
we still talk about Napoleon and Hitler, and they were bad, but we still talk about them.
Yeah, we still talk about them, but we don't draw things. We don't try to emulate them.
No, well, I hope not. Yeah.
And what Paul says, it's emulating Christ is what's going to bring you the riches that the Old Testament writers talked about of being right with God, the peace, the security.
That's what I think we're starting to lack, is the peace with God. All these killings and hatred, etc. There is no peace with God, with them. And,
you know, we talked about with the passage from Isaiah, you know, where the people felt cut off from God, even though they were doing all the things that they thought they were supposed to do with their worship rituals, but they were cut off from God, and they did it to themselves by not living in the image of God, you know, by oppressing people and acting unjustly, and you know, and so forth. And when we get on to Matthew, we're still going to be following the same stream of thought here. This is after the Beatitudes, the sermon, as the first part of the Sermon on the Mount. Again, turning God's wisdom and the world's wisdom upside down. The next part of his teaching, he says, "You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot." I think that's sort of the same message there that Isaiah was giving you, that the people, if he were to say, well, God wants you to be the salt of the earth, well, you've lost your saltiness because you're no longer following in God's ways.
I've always had trouble understanding that little paragraph because I think I took it too literally. And so I've never really understood it very well.
Well, salt, we're used to the imagery of light, but here he says, you're the salt, you are the light. I mean, there's over 200 uses of light as imagery in the Bible. You know, it's a very salt. I have to dig a little bit deeper for, but salt, as you might imagine, was very, very important in that time. And it literally has hundreds of uses, some that were very important to them. And like other natural compounds, it can be used either positively or negatively. At times, salt is used as an image in the Bible to be something very positive, like what Jesus was talking about, preserving, making, enhancing, growing. Those uses of salt, healing even, you know. But then we also have, you know, images of, you know, the Dead Sea and the salt, you know, killing vegetation wouldn't grow. Remember, Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. They can be used both positive and negatively. But the Old Testament writers, they used it with images of seasoning and preserving, but also as desolation and as a curse, as in Lot's wife. In Job, he asked, can something tasteless be eaten without salt? I know many of us wonder about that, if you've ever been put on a salt-free diet. Can anything be eaten without salt? And Paul says, another chapter in this is in Colossians, Paul tells them, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned as it were with salt. The salt with the preserving qualities are symbolic of the permanent relationship with God. They also, just as a literal use, salt was one of the required ingredients for burnt offerings, because it preserved it preserved it until it was used for its purpose. Newborn babies were rubbed with salt. And a new beginning.
Why were they rubbed with salt? Any idea?
I don't know if I've read that it was a ritual that they did, and it had something to do with preservation, maybe preserving a relationship with God. I have to look more into that.
That's interesting. That's very wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound very good, does it?
No, it doesn't.
Well, even animals require salt.
Yes.
Put salt blocks
Salt.
out for animals.
It's essentially, sodium is one of the most important elements, of our body. Our whole system works. The heart works on the electricity of sodium and potassium. And without the presence of both of them, the heart can't function.
That's interesting. Why were babies rubbed? What are you doing now?
Okay.
Well, thank you, Denise. That helps me out, because I've always kind of puzzled about that.
So now, okay, getting back to the Sermon on the Mount. At this point, he's calling on his disciples to be an example for others. God's ability to change lives. He says that in verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and gives light to all in the house. The imagery of light. I can't read that without thinking about the song, This Little Light of Mine.
Yes, I'm gonna let it shine. That's all I could think of too.
I remember a children's choir director. This was a Christian education director, not the choir, actually. And one of the children got up in the service and sang, and they each had one of those little lights like we have, the candle, the fake candle that has the light, and they would cover it up, and then they would raise it up and go, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine.
Yes, I think that makes sense.
And so, just like with salt as seasoning in a food, if it no longer has the properties that will enhance the flavor of the food that it's mixed with, and that's another key element of the imagery, is that salt is always added to other elements. It's not good in itself, but it's what it does when it gets in contact with other elements. That it's valuable. So he said, when it can no longer do that, he says it can be cast aside. And he was likening this to disciples who don't continue their call to mission, to be the church in the world, so to speak. You can hear the echoes. You remember Isaiah 60, we read in the early week, maybe the first week of Epiphany, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. Let's see here. The same, just as salt needs to be, other elements need to be present, without, for the light to be effective, it has to be seen in relationship to darkness. When all it takes is just a little bit of light and darkness is dispelled. You go from not seeing anything to seeing something.
It also provides heat.
Sure, I mean, heat, and now light is even healing. We think about all different therapies, most particularly laser, but there are other light therapies that used to heal. People thought of the sun as being healing. I was reading about, and this is something that I've thought about too, in that it says, we're supposed to let our light shine, Paul says, but then on Ash Wednesday, we have this reading from the very next chapter of Matthew, saying, to do your godliness in private, don't let people see what you're doing. And so I'll read what I collected about that. That Jesus begins this series of his instructions by indicating to his audience that the salt of the earth and the light of the world. The writer here says the verbs here are indicative. That is, they indicate an existing condition. They don't prescribe it. The only prescriptive use in the text is in verse 16, when it says, where does it got it? Well, Matthew 16. In the same, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. And when he's talking, it's not actually a command, rather it is a command to the light itself. This is significant because it means that the human audience is not being issued explicit instructions about how they are to behave. Instead, that which comprises the human essence already, for example, light, is simply instructed to be made even more manifest what it already is. It is not for humans to accomplish any particular work. Humans are simply to allow their core essence to be made more evident. I'm going to keep on reading for this guy. Thus, the seeming contrast between Matthew 5:13-16 and 6:1-4 does not actually present the contradiction that it might seem to pose on the surface, where 6 verses 1-4 is cautioning against the performative enacting of particular actions intended, the intention is important, intended to capture the attention of others. Matthew 5:13-16, in our reading, is instead celebrating the ways in which humans most authentically reflect that which already comprises their essence, their humanness created to be in the image of God. So then he shifts to talking about the law in verses 17-20. The law, and here he's speaking about how the law connects the past and the present, and how he perceives the teaching of the Mosaic law, which for Jesus should not be minimized at all. He's not overturning or modifying the law. He's not creating a new religion. It's just that the law is the foundation for all of his subsequent instruction that he gets. And he speaks to the intention of the law rather than the letter of the law, the words. And this takes us back, to Isaiah about ritual versus the rituals of worship versus the actual enacting of God's word through one's actions. This goes theologically, there's this word called supersessionism, and that means that the idea that Jesus came to overturn Judaism, and now there's not just a new covenant, but everything is new, and totally vanquishes everything from the Old Testament. And Jesus was definitely not, of that thought. I mean, the New Testament wasn't written. The Gospels weren't written when he was. I mean, he very much brings out, and this is something that's important in Matthew, and I've stated that, many times, that it was very important for Matthew to show the continuity of God's actions in the Old Testament and God's actions in the New Testament, or with Christ. Jesus was totally steeped in the traditions of Judaism, and the faith. In fact, he holds the law in great respect. But what had happened was that, again, as we read about in the Old Testament, we read about in Isaiah, in the passage we had for today, that people started concentrating on the letter of the law, and if I do this, God will do this for me. Jesus, it's always about relationship with God and our relationship with one another. And we look at, say, for example, the 10 Commandments. The first 5 are all about our relationship with God. The second 5 are all about our relationship with our neighbors. This is foundational, and Jesus did not steer from that at all. Well, we're getting toward 2 o'clock here. Any thoughts now about, I hope I brought some connections here between the scripture passages. Do you see them?
Especially right living. I see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think last week's readings and this week's readings, are all about what we call getting right with God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about an internal transformation, an internal actions, not external ones.
I also saw how to treat others. I don't know if that was, if I thought that right or not, but they talked about taking care of the poor and those who
Yeah,
needed
I mean,
clothes.
that thread
food.
runs throughout Isaiah, that this is
Mhm.
what God wants from us.
Mhm.
And the psalmist puts it, poetically, in that that when we are right with God, we feel happy or blessed or peaceful or whatever, and we show that in our relationships with others.
Mhm.
I couldn't have gotten there without you, though.
Well, you always, that's why I think Bible study is so important. Not that you're finding right answers, but that every time you read it, you pick up something that you didn't see before.
Yes.
And it's a constant, lifelong adding.
Mhm.
I don't see how they
learning.
ever connect everything. Whoever, somebody has to really study the Bible to make these connections.
Mhm. Well, I think about, the committee that joined together to create the lectionary.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
The minds that, had to look at the entire range of scripture. And this is just a Protestant thing. The Catholics have a lectionary that's very close to ours, too. They have some books that we don't have, in the apocryphal books include, but essentially, all these lectionaries, two lectionaries, were just an incredible meeting of the minds that were just steeped in knowledge of the scriptures.
It's overwhelming, really.
And you look at, all of it, every, the whole of the Christian calendar, which, the lectionary follows, are really all based on the gospel, and then go out from the gospel, because we follow the outline is the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ. We go from, in our Christian calendar year, and our readings, start with Advent, of preparing for Christ's birth, and we go to the end, which is the last day of the year, Christ the King, of sort of the culmination, of Christ's life, which, is finally, his ascension to God.
Yeah.
So, I couldn't have done it. Anyway.
So, wow.
And to me, that's why the lectionary is such a great teaching tool, that without even knowing it, each week, if you follow a service that centers on the scriptures, then, you're going to be, without even knowing it, you're going to be brought into that circle, of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. So, okay, well, this would be the spot for Mary Lee to cut it off when she goes back next that. So, any other thoughts or comments before we go?
No.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.